Good morning. My name is Stéphanie Dolata, and I am the course coordinator of the distance course Quantitative Methods in Monitoring and Evaluating the Delivery of Comprehensive HIV and Sexuality Education. Today, we have the pleasure to welcome Christophe Cornu for our Module 3 module. Christophe is a team leader in the section of Health and Education at the headquarters at UNESCO. And Christophe and myself, we have been working long time, more than 10 years, on the UNESCO work for monitoring and evaluating the education sector response to HIV needs. And Christophe was a coordinator of this big project. So today we have the great pleasure to welcome you and to invite you to make a presentation about one key important issue, that is data triangulation. How to analyze the indicators from different sources of information in order to monitor and evaluate the impact of the delivery of comprehensive HIV and sexuality education. So this is an introduction about data triangulation, and we also ask you to share a little bit of your experience, a very long experience in this field.
Well, thank you very much, Stephanie, for inviting me to speak during this course. It's true that it has been a very long process. We started a long time ago, and we actually started in East and Southern Africa to work on these indicators to measure the delivery of sexuality education, HIV and sexuality education. And during this process, we realized that data collection, data analysis is very important, but sometimes what we realize when we receive reports is that data triangulation is missing, which is why we decided to develop this particular session for this course. I'll start my presentation on data triangulation to improve analysis, interpretation, and reporting. But before I start my presentation, I would like you to take a few minutes to think about the questions that will show up on the screen. You may think that some of these questions are not related to monitoring and evaluation or to research in general, but actually they are. So please try to answer those questions, thinking about your life in general, but also about your work dealing with data, whether you are a statistician, a researcher, policymaker, or whatever you do in relation with monitoring and evaluation. So what will you learn during this presentation? Hopefully, you will learn the following things today. First, you will learn what triangulation is, in particular data triangulation. You will also learn what the benefits are of using data triangulation when you analyze and interpret data, and especially when the final objective is to make informed decisions about something. The objective of this presentation is to provide you not only with knowledge, but also with skills. So you will also learn how to use data triangulation concretely when you analyze and interpret data on comprehensive HIV and sexuality education, and when you report on this data. And finally, also from a very practical perspective, you will learn what the basic steps are when you conduct data triangulation, and also who should be involved in that process. So let's start with the first part of this presentation, and I will explain what exactly data triangulation is. The word triangulation was used in research for the first time in the 70s, and it was used to refer to sociological research methods. It was an American sociologist, Norman Danson, who worked a lot on research methods, and particularly qualitative research methods, who identified 4 types of triangulation. The first one is data triangulation, and this refers to the process of combining data from different sources to study a particular social phenomenon. That's very simple to understand. Even if you conduct only one study, you are able to use multiple data sources. The second form of triangulation is called investigator triangulation. That's also very easy to understand. It describes the fact that multiple researchers study the same phenomenon. The third form of triangulation is theory triangulation, and this refers to the utilization of multiple conceptual approaches to interpret the results of a study. And finally, the fourth form of triangulation is methodological triangulation, and it refers to the use of multiple research methods to conduct a study. So today, for the purpose of this course, we will focus only on data triangulation, the first form of triangulation listed on the slide, which is the use of multiple data sources to analyze and interpret data. So let's explore a little bit further what data triangulation is. As I just said, it means using a variety of data sources. For what? First, to combine findings from those different sources. But you don't combine findings just for the sake of combining them. You combine them because you want to compare this data coming from different sources. And if you compare them, you also do it for a series of reasons. You want to confirm, for example, whether the findings coming from one source are similar to those coming from another source. And you also compare the data to look at correlations between data coming from different sources. What do we mean by correlations? Well, for example, causalities. By comparing, you should be able to identify areas of convergence between findings. This means that the same trends will come out of the analysis of the findings from various surveys, various studies. And by comparing the findings, you should also be able to identify divergence and inconsistencies between findings, what we call dissimilar data. And obviously, if there are inconsistencies, you will need to understand why findings are inconsistent between the different sources of data you've been using. So one of the reasons why findings are inconsistent may be that findings from a particular source are questionable. For example, as a result of flaws in data collection, processing of survey or study design. For example, the sample size was too small or was actually not representative, even if the researchers claimed it was. Comparison and the analysis of correlations and differences between findings will also help you generate new hypotheses, meaning that you will be able to come up with analysis that you would have never come up with if you had focused only on one source of data. So at the end of the day, why do you do all this? Because you want to have an overall picture of the evidence. You don't want an analysis that is partial or biased. And you want basically to find the truth. And this should be the obsession of any person working on data, finding the truth. Now, what do we mean by different data sources? We mean, of course, different surveys, different studies conducted by the same organization or preferably by different organizations. And we mean also similar indicators providing data on the same issue coming from different surveys. And finally, we mean different indicators coming from the same survey, for example, indicators providing data on different issues. I just want to highlight that triangulation of data for analysis and interpretation is mostly done with quantitative data. because it's often difficult to code qualitative data, and the risk is to try to compare apples and oranges. This doesn't mean that qualitative data shouldn't be used in data triangulation, but it's more difficult, and only very experienced researchers with extensive expertise in data triangulation usually do it. I've been talking about data triangulation in the context of monitoring, evaluation, and research, but we actually do data triangulation every day in our life, and I would say that if you don't triangulate data in your daily life, well, you have a problem. So let me give you two examples of data triangulation for which you will see that you have probably already done some data triangulation today and that you already know very well what data triangulation is. First example, I heard that there will be a restructuring in my ministry. However, I'm not sure about the scope of the restructuring and how the process could affect me. I'm going to call my colleague John, source A, to ask him a few questions about what he knows. Then I will send an email to my boss, source B, in order to find out whether there is some official information. I may also read the newsletter sent by the union, source C. As soon as there is an administrative circular, source D, I will read it carefully. Once I gather information from these four sources, I will come up with an analysis of what exactly will happen, and I will interpret how this will affect my position and my future. So in this example, there are four sources, and what you will do with the data you will get from those four sources will be exactly what I described before in the presentation. You will combine, you will compare the data, and you will try to find out what is true and what is false. One very good example, and that's the second example of data triangulation, which is not related to research, is what the police does or should do when they investigate a case. It's easy to understand that no investigation should be based on one testimony, on only one piece of evidence, even if, unfortunately, it can be the case. So in this particular situation, interrogating various people, collecting various pieces of evidence from the crime scene is really crucial so that judges can make decisions based on the best evidence. And in some cases, the life of someone can depend on how well data triangulation is done. And in this case, data triangulation can be a matter of life and death. Fortunately, in our work, the implications of data triangulation may not be so dramatic. However, if you think about it well, if we triangulate the data badly, this can lead to bad analysis, bad interpretation, and eventually to bad decisions by policymakers. I will present now more systematically the benefits of using data triangulation, even if I'm sure that you start to understand what these benefits are. So let's have a look at those many benefits of data triangulation. First, any weaknesses in the data from one source will be compensated for by the strength of other data. That's what I explained when you think about questionable data coming from one source. It reduces the risk of using only poor quality data if you focus only on one study that was badly designed or badly conducted. It will allow you responding complex questions because of the different indicators, different sources you will use. It will increase the validity and reliability of your analysis and of your interpretation, and it will reduce the risk of false or biased interpretations, which is often the case if you have only one source. It will provide a more complete and comprehensive perspective on the specific phenomenon you're looking at. And it will also improve the possibility to conduct trend data analysis and to strengthen this type of analysis. So at the end of the day, this will be real evidence that decision maker will be able to use to make informed and strategic decisions. And over time, data triangulation has proved to be a very effective way for reviewing, corroborating findings from surveys, studies, etc. And for all these reasons, data triangulation should be a routine activity for data analysis and interpretation, not an ad hoc one, and it should be always an institutionalized component of monitoring and evaluation. Now we've seen what data triangulation is, we've seen the benefits. Let's move to the third part of my presentation, and I will explain how you can use data triangulation specifically for the analysis and interpretation of data on comprehensive HIV and sexuality education. First of all, let's have a look at the type of data we need to analyze. We need for an in-depth analysis of comprehensive HIV and sexuality education, and also who usually collects the data and what the main sources are. So you can see on the slide 3 columns. The type of data we need to analyze is listed in the left column of the slide. Basically, we should look at the following data. First, the data on the modalities of the delivery of sexuality education in schools. This will be measured by process indicators. Then we should also analyze data on changes in knowledge resulting from the delivery of sexuality education, and this will be measured by outcome indicators. We'll also look at changes in health behaviors also resulting from the delivery of sexuality education. And these behavior changes are also measured by outcome indicators. And finally, we should look at the results of behavior changes that can be attributed to sexuality education in terms of impacts. And of course, this will be measured by impact indicators. Now, if we look at who is collecting the data, and this is in the column in the middle, we see that data on processes is collected by the education sector. Data on knowledge levels is collected both by the education sector and the health sector. And finally, data on health outcomes and impact are collected by the health sector, which makes sense. So the sources of data for process indicators are school-based surveys, and you can see that in the column on the right-hand side of the slide. The sources of data for indicators of knowledge are both school-based surveys and population-based surveys. And the sources of indicators for other outcome indicators are only population-based surveys. I think you have already received the list of the 20 international core indicators that we have selected to measure comprehensive HIV and sexuality education. These 20 internationally recognized indicators are included in 2 main frameworks. On the slide, you can see a reminder on these 2 frameworks. 8 indicators are including the guidelines for the construction and use of core indicators to measure education sector responses to HIV and AIDS. And 12 indicators are included in the regional accountability framework for East and Southern Africa. And these indicators are also called RAF indicators. RAF is the acronym for Regional Accountability Framework. So you can see on the slide a first table reminding you, listing again these indicators, but I trust that you have this list of indicators. So just as a reminder, you can see here the process indicators that measure the modalities of delivery of sexuality education. And for this indicator, the source is the annual school census. You can see also the outcome indicator that measures knowledge levels. That's GC6, and the main source for this is currently SACMEC or CACMEC, using the new acronym. And the two outcome indicators that measure sexual behavior changes, for which several population-based surveys collect data, are also listed. That's GC7 and GC8, and the population-based surveys used to collect data for those indicators are the DHS, MIX, and also the AIDS Indicator Survey, AIS, which is close to the DHS program. There's another indicator on the slide, GC14, but we actually don't use anymore this indicator in relation to comprehensive sexuality education. Now, if we look very briefly at the 12 indicators, including in the regional accountability framework, you see that all these indicators measure both outcomes and impacts. And as I mentioned before, all of them are, data for all of these indicators are collected for the same population-based surveys, DHS, MIX, and AIS. So basically, on these two slides, you've seen all the sources we need for data triangulation on comprehensive HIV and sexuality education in terms of both the surveys you need to use and the indicators you need to use. After this reminder of the sources, including the indicators that you can use for data triangulation, now I would like to give you some concrete examples of data triangulation using some of these indicators so that you understand clearly what can be triangulated and how. We will start with indicators measuring modalities of delivery of CSE, i.e. process indicator. So let's take the example of indicator GC3. GC3 measures the percentage of schools delivering CSE. If you analyze data collected for this indicator only, of course, it's interesting to know whether the percentage is going up, is going down, or remains the same. However, it will be only through data triangulation of data collected for this indicator and for other process indicator that you will be able to generate hypotheses on correlations between processes. For example, you need to look at data for both GC3 and for GC4 on schools providing parents, guardians with an orientation process to understand whether the fact that parents and guardians are provided with this orientation process is going to increase or not the delivery of CSE. For example, if parents know more about CSE, we can assume that there will be less resistance from these parents to accept that CSE is delivered in schools. But it's just an hypothesis, and you can verify this hypothesis by triangulating data from GC3 and GC4. Now, if we look GC3 and GC4, then you'll be able to understand another correlation. It would be very strange if the percentage of schools with teachers trained in delivering CSE, which is GC4, was much higher than the percentage of schools actually delivering CSE. In this case, you may question the quality of data that has been collected through the annual school census. And you will also link this to the quality of CSE delivered, which will be discussed in a minute. If the percentage of schools where CSE is delivered is high, but if the percentage of schools where teachers have been trained is very low, you may wonder whether the quality of the CSE that is delivered is good or not. You will find detailed guidelines on the interpretation for indicator GC3 in the guidelines developed by UNESCO, and this is on page 50. Now, if we have a look at indicators measuring learning outcomes, in this case, the knowledge about HIV and other CAC related topics. There are two main indicators that measure this. One is GC6, for which data have been collected for SACMEC, and the other one is RAF1, for which data have been collected through a population-based survey. Obviously, first you want to analyze the data for both indicators in your country and find out whether the knowledge levels go up or down. And you also want to triangulate data from this indicator to check whether the trends are the same in your country. Because if for one indicator the levels go up and for another indicator the levels go down, well, you have to understand why. However, only by triangulating the data for these two indicators and process indicators, you will be understand correlations or lack of correlations between the trends in knowledge levels and the delivery of sexuality education. So what do I mean by this? For example, you should compare data for GC3 and analyze whether the higher percentage of schools delivering CSE is going to lead to an increase in knowledge levels. And there may be a high percentage of schools delivering CSE, but a low level of schools with teachers trained. And in this case, again, is there any correlation between the fact that few teachers are trained and low levels of knowledge? One hypothesis is that teachers who are poorly trained won't be able to convey or to provide good CSE education, and therefore CSE education delivered won't have any impact on the knowledge levels of pupils. Specific guidelines, again, for the interpretation of data for this indicator are provided in the UNESCO guidelines, and you will find those specific guidelines on page 60 and page 61. So now let's take a third example, and this third example will illustrate potential data triangulation between process indicators on the delivery of CSE, outcome indicators on the level of knowledge, and outcome indicators measuring sexual behavior changes. For example, if you analyze data for GC7 and GC8 on, respectively, early sexual debut and condom use, of course, again, it will be important to analyze the data for each indicator and find out whether young people have sex earlier than before, or whether they use less or more condoms than before. However, you also want to know why. And in this case, there are a few hypotheses that you want to explore. You want to explore whether there's a correlation between more and better quality CSE in schools and later sexual debut, and also higher condom use. You also want to know whether there's a correlation between more and better quality CSE in schools, higher knowledge levels, and later sexual debut and higher condom use. This means that in this case, you should triangulate data from at least 5 indicators and 4 surveys. What is complicated in this case, and when you start to triangulate data from process indicators with data from outcome indicators on behavior change, is the level of correlation. Because it is impossible to attribute behavior change to one single reason. Behavior change is always the result of many factors. And in the case of CSE, you can only explain that CSE is likely to have contributed to this change in behavior. You will also find specific guidelines for these indicators in the UNESCO document on page 64 and page 67. And this is a very important rule for data triangulation. As I just mentioned, for all outcome indicators, correlation needs to be analyzed very carefully. As I just said, behavior change can be attributed to many things, not just to the delivery of sexuality education. And as I said, CSE can only contribute to behavior change, while the correlation between the delivery of CSE an improved knowledge level is more straightforward. And obviously, when it comes to impact and showing that CAC has had an impact on, for example, HIV incidence or early and unintended pregnancies, this is even more complicated. This can be done only with very, very large national data sets and over a very long period of time. Always keeping in mind that we can refer only to contribution and never to attribution. And we have to remind ourselves that data triangulation is not an exact science. So we've seen a series of very concrete examples related to comprehensive HIV and sexuality education. Now let's have a look at something also very practical for the work you're going to do when you're going to analyze and interpret the data that you have collected or that you're going to collect on this topic. We're going to look at the basic steps to conduct data triangulation and also who in your country should be involved. So the basic steps. Of course, the first thing you need to do is to map what data sources are available in your country in relation to CAC. So it's not complicated since we have already listed for you all the surveys that collect data on CAC. So basically what you have to do is just to check in your country whether these surveys have been conducted and when. It's important to identify the rounds of data collection for analysis of trends over time. And of course, you want to check on what education level surveys were conducted. So were these surveys conducted looking at primary education, secondary education, etc., or for what age range? So once you have your list of surveys, including the dates of rounds of data collection, then you can request the data from the institutions, organization who managed the surveys or who conducted the studies. For the population-based surveys, this is really easy because most data for GHS and MIX are available online. Then you need to collect and aggregate the data from the various sources that were identified. While you do this, you should dismiss data that are too old. Although, in the case of CAC, it's not something that's likely to happen. Then you should also agree on the period for which data triangulation will be conducted, particularly if you want to conduct an analysis of data trends over time, if it's possible and if it's relevant. In some of your countries, you won't have the possibility to conduct this data trends analysis because you will have only one round of data collection. So, if you plan to use data from studies that are not recognized international surveys, you need to be really careful about the research methods that were used, and you will dismiss data that were collected using methods that don't seem serious enough. Obviously, this is not something that will happen if you use only reliable sources. The following step, well, you have collated the data. It's better for you to present it in a graphic way, for example, through tables, because then it will be easier for you to compare the similarities and the differences. In terms of the method you're going to use for data triangulation, it's really important that you are very systematic. So you should start by comparing data from different sources on the same topic. For example, you'll find data on HIV knowledge coming both from SACMEC and the national reporting on HIV/AIDS. So you need to check whether these data are similar or different, and if possible, understand why. Then you should compare data from the same source on different topics that can be related. This was the example we saw with the different process indicators collected for the annual school census. This will help you analyze correlations, causalities, and come up with some early conclusions. And then finally, if enough data are available, you will compare data from different sources on different topics. This will allow you to confirm or to refute your hypothesis. Last set of steps for you to finalize data triangulation. Well, you will have a list of hypotheses. So and you'll have different categories. So for those hypotheses that are supported by one source, only one source of data, and remember that you should always reference the source, then you will have hypotheses that are supported or confirmed by the comparison of data coming from different sources, which means different indicators in the same survey or different surveys. And again, always reference the sources. And finally, you will have hypotheses that are refuted by the comparison of data you have conducted coming from different sources. So what you can do at this stage is to summarize your interpretation of the data using hypotheses that are either supported by only one source of data or supported, confirmed by the comparison of data coming from different sources. And of course, for those hypotheses that are refuted by the comparison of data coming from different sources, well, you should discard them because they're not valid anymore. And again, sources should always be mentioned because you need to document thoroughly your conclusions, otherwise they may be criticized. So let's last guidelines on or last concrete advice on who should be involved in data triangulation. So you will involve EMIS representatives. I mean, because the EMIS representatives are people who collect and analyze the data, at least coming from the education sector. Then you would need to involve policymakers in the Ministry of Education and other relevant ministries involved in policies related to sexuality education, and that's, for example, the Ministry of Health. And when I say policymakers, it's going to be also statisticians from those ministries, especially from the Ministry of Health. Then it's good to involve development partners who support the surveys that provide the data for triangulation, including the school-based surveys and the household surveys. So that can be UNAIDS, UNESCO, in countries where the UNESCO Institute for Statistics is working, it's also good to involve the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, and then UNICEF, WHO, etc. And then it can be very useful to involve national researchers who have expertise in the area of sexuality education and or in the triangulation of data. So something you can do is to set up a small task force to analyze and interpret the data using data triangulation, including people who are technically proficient and who will provide regular support for the triangulation efforts. So I hope that this was clear, and the presentation is now coming to an end. I hope that you enjoyed learning more about data triangulation, and to conclude, I would like to emphasize some key messages. So first message, data triangulation, I think you understood by now, is using different sources. Data triangulation should be an institutionalized component of monitoring and evaluation, because it dramatically improves data analysis and interpretation. So don't think about data triangulation, something that you can do from time to time. It's something that you should always do, and whether it's sexuality education or any other topic. And triangulation of data related to CSE will really help make decisions on policies and programs that are really based on the best evidence. So the two main sources I've used for developing this presentation are first a document that was published by UNAIDS in 2010, an introduction to triangulation, and then the guidelines for the construction and use of core indicators that were developed by my team in collaboration with the IEP, and they were published in 2013. Thanks a lot for your attention, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to post these questions on the internet. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, Christophe, to come here and then to make this presentation. I think your presentation, okay, it is very, very interesting, and it is so relevant now, not only in this field, but as well in terms of SDGs indicators, because we have indicators from different sources of data, from EMIS, this is what you discussed, but even from the health sector. So how to combine those information, it is so useful, and I think this is a very new field in the education field, and as well as SDGs indicators. And thank you very much for your contribution.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I hope that you enjoyed the presentation, and that later today or tomorrow you'll start to triangulate the data, and that you will enjoy it as much as we do here. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just would like to, I forgot to mention something. If you have any question about data and triangulation, do not hesitate to post your questions into the online forum discussion, and we will respond to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.